Farah, it's so good to have you here. Welcome.
Likewise, Neil, the honor and thrill is all mine, quite frankly. And Portal to Ascension's absolutely my favorite platform for everything
That's
Starseed related, Ascension related, etc.
that's
So
so awesome. Thank
thank
you
you
so
so
much.
much. So I'll just go ahead and give a very brief intro.
Please.
So I live here in the East Coast of the United States, and for the past close to 15 years, I'd say between the 10 and 15 year time frame, I've been getting some very strange downloads. At that time, I had actually was still viewing life through a very 3D prism. And it was very interesting how my intuition was working and guiding me to understand this particular technology that I was receiving. I never necessarily heard it as a separate voice from my own mind, but it came to me through clear cognizance. And there was always confirmations and validation in my external reality, despite how abstract some of these concepts, quite frankly, sounded to my own logical 3D mind at the time. So today's topic is transmission of data to our star families through ancient technology and stories. And I'll be under the assumption that the audience is already familiar with certain terms, but Neil, please, interject if you would like me to expound on some concepts. So I think that the one question here, or basically, the starting thesis is, what's the big deal or concern of the acceleration of AI? And you could say that AI is rapidly progressing and having humans overall think more about consciousness, especially in 3D arenas. There's a continuous debate as to whether AI will supersede the intelligence of humanity, and if it already has, and at what point this is going to happen. And if AI does supersede human intelligence, who's going to benefit from that? So this presentation is not intended to be a discussion of polarity, as AI clearly has its value, and I use it all the time. But there's a perspective that AI is being used for nefarious purposes, not only on this human 3D plane, but across the universe. So what I've channeled is that consciousness needs to be preserved under the guardianship of God and or source. And the method for that is building a telecommunication system to have star families or our own particular star families circulate data from humans who are in resonance with this idea, and also integrate their interdimensional selves to become one whole self. And there's the question as to where does this consciousness that's collected from us go? And I would say that it goes past an interconnected beltway of stargates called the cosmic web to a unified consciousness field. And I know that we tend to categorize the unified consciousness field as where it's just like the still point of all consciousness. But how it's emanated to my mind in my own through my own channelings is a place called the interroots. And we're from the interroots, there's a journey to ascend even further. So the question again is, who would this process of collecting the data for this ascension purpose benefit? Well, this process benefits us primarily, but it does admittedly benefit some of our own star families for the purposes of their own ascension. I know that not all star beings require the ascension process, but this whole point is for us to connect together as one universal mind and to view ourselves as one self or body. So the collection of data and then this transformation or alchemization of ourselves viewing us as being one full body in conjunction with our star families is more so to break through the prism and limitations of our own 3D perception. So it's really benefiting ourselves. And we ourselves are like a perfect system, as we can tell from how the way our biology works. And you can liken us to devices, and that we also have interfaces with our star families. And one of the ways in which we are perfect systems, like I mentioned, is through our bodies, but also our DNA. But anyway, when we go ahead and consider DNA, we can ask ourselves the question as to why DNA is important. And through one person alone, our star families can access the entire memory bank of galactic history and access the Akashic field. And if we're to think about our additional DNA strands beyond the quantity that we're told we have, you can also consider that each unique individual will also have a unique imprint of that history inside of them. So even if we all have access to that galactic history in the Akashic field, given that we're all unique individuals / organisms, we are all going to be having unique perceptions of reality and, and or consciousness. So in our DNA, there's also the remembrance of archetypes that we come into this world with. These archetypes have a connection to the lessons we are supposed to learn in Earth School, which lead us to our purpose. These archetypes are another sort of blueprint stored in our DNA. So when we think about, our DNA that determines how we look and basically even our personality traits, we also have our archetypal blueprints that we come into this world with that is connected to our DNA or is inherent in our DNA. And our journey here on Earth School is to uncover those archetypes in order to find our life's lessons to see how these two interplay. Okay, there we go. Excellent. So one of the ways in which the archetypes come into play, of course, is through stories. And higher consciousness is not transmitted through all stories. And you can take into consideration comedy shows or anything that you can watch on TV, and binge watch, because these are oftentimes deliberately intended to keep us stuck in lower consciousness. However, we humans are generally wired to understand and communicate through story. And stories were also a means of transport to other realities used by the ancients, much like the dream state and astral that we use today. Stories were often told by an elder or a storyteller, and it was a very highly revered art form. Stories are also how symbols and messages are passed down from one era or generation to the next, and are also oftentimes channeled from the collective unconscious, which is the repository of all human thought. Stories like fairy tales and myths can also reflect a story of transformation, reflecting something to us on a soul level. And, not all fairy tales do this. Is certain fairy tales are a more primordial form of story. Usually but they do oftentimes still involve a sense of transformation that has some significance for us and some symbolism for us that we can tap into to identify particular life themes that are really universal for us universal to us as humans. But it's really through the myth that you can find lessons for how a soul is really to unfold. It may not necessarily, sometimes each culture will have its own form of a myth and its own cultural attributions to it. Nonetheless, the underlying threads and themes are so universal that one can oftentimes find lessons etched in within those myths. And archetypes are linked to stargates through the constellations, since constellations themselves are based on stories and archetypal images. And remembering archetypes activates remembrance within us, in our DNA. And when we learn how to map our own life stories and experiences to these archetypes, it's how our star families can collect data for our own ascension as well as theirs, and enable our human consciousness access through the stargates. So the key is learning our archetypal blueprint and finding how to map our archetypes to our star families to get the required data to them. And in turn, we also receive data, but I'll get into that a bit more later. And I'd like to also explain why stories are the means through which consciousness is always circulated. While stories are oftentimes by default connected to archetypes, as the characters in them represent ideas for the unfolding of the plot. And like I said before, stories like fairy tales and myths can also reflect a story of transformation, which reflects something to us on a soul level. And oftentimes the same types of stories are shared across different cultures and authors, as there is an urging from our collective unconscious to share these stories. And that's exactly how I was able to channel, because I had an impulse to write. I just had an impulse to write something like sci-fi or philosophical, but little did I know that this was actually an ancient technology, and I hope to explain more about that shortly. But I do want to impart that bullet point that interconnected stargates and galaxies are referred to as the cosmic web. And basically, in astronomical terms, you could say the filaments connecting, if not stargates, galaxies is the cosmic web. So now how this telecommunication system looks, and there's a structure and overview. And this here, Neil, I'm happy to expound on anything if you feel like it's a little too much verbiage. But
Well, let me jump on for a second here. Well, let me full screen this again.
Sure.
So no, definitely it's not too much verbiage, it's perfect verbiage. But this is amazing. I really, really love what you're doing here. Just gonna make a comment or everything, because there's so much gold in what you're saying that I want to reiterate some of these words, right?
Sure, please.
It's really genius. Archetypes are stored in our DNA. Yes, we understand that. And lessons are in the myth, but the whole concept of the archetypal nature coming from our unconscious, and the collective consciousness has a reason and a purpose to share these stories, maybe to work out certain traumas, maybe to work out certain belief systems, or to expand and ascend. And how that connects to our star systems, I see what you're saying here. There's a cosmic web that goes through myth stories, through our unconscious, that then interplays into our stories, that also connects to the stories of these constellations. The story of Orion, right? We have them in the Greek text, we have them in Indian text, all these stories. And why are they so similar across the board? Because our unconscious mind is trying to process something, or tell us something, remind us of something.
You're brilliant, Neil. I couldn't have said it better myself. You just said it, you summed it up so perfectly. Thank you so much.
Yes, please
I
continue.
really appreciate that. That was awesome. And on top of that, the way giving how beautifully you summarize that. Now we're talking about this through the perspective of story, right? And as I mentioned earlier, there's this aspect of an ancient technology that I was channeling, which I didn't know. But now when writing the story, there are these strange things and images and symbols coming to my mind. And then I began to understand that our star families want us to transmit the stories within ourselves, because that's how they're collecting the data, through a telecommunication system, which is already inherent in Earth's natural Wi-Fi, or its metaphysical Wi-Fi. So I'll get into a little more as to how we can access the telecommunication system and all that. But right now we'll work through the different components of it. And it's very much like an internet infrastructure system in some ways. So the spiritual terminology we can use here is that our telecommunication system links the crystalline grid, ley lines, stargates called the cosmic web, as you beautifully summarized, the collective unconscious, higher mind, and portals. And together, all of this functions like Wi-Fi. And what the interplay of all of these elements involve is the data transmission through portals to facilitate data transfer through trees and sacred sites. So I could have included an image with the sea of meaning, but how can I explain this? I'm going to close my eyes to be able to visualize all of this better. So you see the island here, that represents Self Island, and this is past the pineal gland in our minds, and it's basically a representation of higher mind. It might seem funny as to how it looks, because I know we all have a very different impression. If a higher mind were to be depicted visually, it could have looked like so much more grand or spectacular or ethereal, but it came to me in the form of an island. And it also came to me in the form of being a modem in this telecommunication system, just as we need a modem to communicate to our internet, to our home devices. We also have an internal modem within ourselves, which is our higher mind. And there we have an antenna being the tree of life. And if we're to also look at that image here, and I'm going to zoom in here too, you can see that it has a bunch of different elements here. At the center of it all, where there's the dragon, and that dragon is actually representing the ego. In the center, you will see the spiritual heart there. And it's actually in its center is a crystal. Then above that is a chest, a skeleton's chest, which I refer to as the treasure chest. And then you'll see the rest of the body here as like the skeleton's different, like, you know, the other forms of its body to kind of symbolize the fact that this is self-island within our own human self. And so what happens is that there's a surrounding sea of meaning around the island, which contains the data from every single human's mind throughout history. It is very much the collective unconscious, but I also have another representation of the collective unconscious. So I just kind of pretty much, to use technological terms, you can see this as a data lake, but in this case, it's a data sea. And it's like basically what AI is using, right, with its language models. So this is how we're able to all thoughts throughout history basically drained here through every single mind. And so the data that's pertinent to our life purpose is what comes to this island. And if you're able to take a close up, you can see that there's a cosmic web there. And so there's two pathways for this, for the waves to come to the island that's related to our purpose. It can either attach itself to the cosmic web, or it can drip past and make our spiritual heart beat. And it's what that data that makes our spiritual heart beat that does so many other things. One of them is that reverberation is our soul song, and that goes up through the tree of life and as you notice, the tree of life here is dead. Why? Because salt is deadly for trees. And so that all data that is a remembrance of our purpose makes the tree come alive. And it also does something simultaneously where it then, you'll also see a worm here, which I'll explain to in a bit what's going on there. But there's also that soul song then gets transmitted under earth, because you can see in this map here with earth, you can kind of see it. I know it's a cartoonish representation, but you can see the island, you know, connecting to earth. And from there, that soul song is able to create an EM, an electromagnetic field with earth's core. And and then similarly, there's a crystalline grid that's being drawn between within our own island and under earth. And so the dragons under earth take those threads, and as the crystalline grid is being drawn through us, there's a Merkaba being formed, and earth has her own Merkaba. And the dragons form that. And then there is a worm in what I call the Black Forest, which is the collective consciousness field, or the representation of the collective consciousness field. And there's a reason for why it's called the Black Forest, because trees are very, very important databases, and the amount of information that they can hold cellularly and interdimensionally. So trees also have passageways across different dimensions and are based on routes, geographical routes. Well, in the context of all of this, these geographical routes represent our veins and arteries. And so when the dragons are drawing the Merkaba under earth, there's a worm in the collective unconscious who's picking up on these and stitching connections from different portals and sacred sites across earth. So and then there's a thread here, which I'll also get into the significance.
Quick question. So
Please.
worm, so Do you mean you don't mean a literal worm? Could you explain
Oh, no, no.
Yeah, can you
Yes, yes,
explain?
I apologize. Thank you so much, Neil, for that. No, no, no. People will think I'm like so crazy if I said it was a literal worm. No, that's the thing, and that's the interesting part. See, when I was writing all of this, I began to imagine different characters who are time hopping characters who are my interdimensional selves and who are able to open portals and such, and how they're all able to access one another. These interdimensional selves is through the trees, and there's a worm, but not all of them can really see that worm. I believe that worm is in another dimension to symbolize wormholes. So there's a wormhole in our higher mind that's connecting to the collective unconscious, which then has an interface with the trees, and similarly the mycelium as well.
Yes. So there's the worm, which obviously, yeah, that's a good one. It represents the wormhole, which is in a higher mind, like we're made out of infinite singularities, in which it connects to the data set of awareness that goes beyond this dimension through the subatomic world, which is the wormhole, that then connects to the trees, the mycelium, which is the network and the nervous system and the arteries of the earth, that is a relay communication between our earth and our consciousness, basically.
Exactly, exactly. Again, Neil, oh my goodness, I'm just so impressed by how your powers of summation. Totally agree. Exactly. And I forgot to mention one other thing. If you notice, South Island also looks like a DNA tunnel because it's symbolizing the human myth, right? It's symbolizing all of human consciousness. And the South Island is actually one single South Island for all of us, that higher mind. But each human being's South Island's representation is only distinguished by an ID being the Fibonacci sequence. So it's numerically distinguished, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of like how each person's able to access that island. And if you also notice, all islands are also volcanoes as well. So there's this symbolism of the inner and outer connecting and the lava. And then there's also the aspect of alchemy and the different elements too inside of the inside of the inside of South Island, because an island, it's a perfect ecosystem and balance of earth, water, fire, and air. And so that's what is symbolizing here, the T. And that is because tea itself, and I have an entire story related to this on innerroots.com, and it's also related to the story I told you about, Neil, related to my grandfather and Orion. It's totally connected. You see these white markings on the cups? These white markings symbolize cotton, and this is a very common motif from Uzbekistan. I don't know if you know this, but Uzbekistan means the land of self-sovereignty. And because it represents cotton, cotton over there is referred to as white gold. So cotton is an everyday household item that we take for granted, right? Like how cotton, it's so invaluable, it's so cheap. But just like our stories that we can think about, our life stories, there's so much data in our life stories that we fail to alchemize to really understand the value related to our worth and related to what we're supposed to learn. And so these cups spin, and it's also acting very much like a medicine wheel. So when, as I mentioned earlier, when that soul song and it's beating, right, and it's creating the EM field with earth, what's happening is a soul song rises and it goes up the roots of the tree, and that is acting so much like a transmitter at that point to our star families, and it's going up. The T then begins to come, because prior to all of this, when we're out of balance, those cups spin really, really frantically. But when it comes into perfect order, our cups get filled. And it was through Lori Nitt's presentation where this got confirmed for me. Neil, do you remember when it was talking about how Stargates open on the open and fill
Right.
principle?
Hmm?
Well, that's how this came. And I understood that during the presentation as to why that was happening. So these cups are filling, and tea also is a symbol. And the Turkish people refer to tea as rabbit's blood. Like when it's so red, because it's like, when it attains that perfect tint or shade, it's like, oh, it's red like rabbit's blood. Well, what do rabbits symbolize? Fertility and like the generation of life. So that's why I'm seeing tea here as a metaphor for the elixir of life. And that's all been spun up from what? The salt and the waves. And I'm also going to get into that other component of our of this system, because I failed to mention one thing prior, is that on Earth, Neil, we also have our ley lines, right? And these ley lines are they're akin to fiber optic cables under the earth, those cables that allow us to connect online. And what those do is they emit carrier waves. And it's those carrier waves that then go into our brain to modulate, because that's how radio works, right? When an empty wave is oftentimes transmitted, it has to modulate or rot or, intertwine or whatever with a wave that actually does have the data. So that's what's going in through our pineal gland to become the ocean wave that gets carried to the psyche. So here, when we're in our 3D realities, we don't really notice anything that's going on metaphysically. Some of us can, who are really, really attuned, but some of us, like myself, require a story world to be able to visualize all of this. And it's getting me to understand how all of these different layers of reality are working. And what else is it? Let me just try to take a look at my notes here to see. Oh, I failed to mention the crystalline grid. So while the ley lines and crystalline grid have like very similar overlap, they have a lot of overlap, obviously, but the crystalline grid is more so powering the electricity. So just as the internet needs internet cables or satellites or whatever, similarly, it also needs electricity to power. So the crystalline grid is different in that sense. And that's how the thread is coming down from the cups that you see here represented by the white gold mark. I'm sorry, the white cotton to become gold. That's getting taken and drying the Merkaba through the soil of the island. And I also forgot to mention, Neil, that the soil of the island is in the shape of our fingerprints, because our fingerprints are very powerful access points. And they all oftentimes, for those, and I'm not talking about conventional palmistry here, I'm talking about the actual power that's contained within them to reflect our identity, to reflect the vibrational power, etc. And it's the lessons that are conveyed through the hands. And it's also, like I mentioned, a marker of identity. So the worm is doing the clearings of our cellular memories inside of the soil to be able to draw the thread through to the dragons underneath Earth. And so, yeah, would love to hear your thoughts, Neil. Sorry, I just...
Yeah, no, I'm with you. No thoughts on there, just receiving it, but definitely the connection to the dragons, because I had the regression where I met the dragons in the inner world. So that connection also, because the dragons that I connected to might not be the same dragons, may be the same dragons, were responsible for stewarding the birthing process, which was going through the wormhole, here we go again, of the womb, because the womb is also a wormhole. Because as I like to say, if the womb was not a wormhole and we have a soul, then that means a woman who has babies has every soul that could ever be already inside of her womb. But that's not the case. They come from somewhere, and they come from this inception of this wormhole from another dimension. So the dragons in the inner world that I saw were actually stewarding the wormhole process in not in physical form, but through apparitions, kind of like ghosts or spirits, to seed the womb. So which also connects to the individual identity, because that's the individual being coming in. And it also makes sense with the fingerprint. So you're saying this is like our own, this is kind of the, what is it, the symbol of an individual. So therefore the soil is like the hand, because the hand holds the identity of an individual person. No matter how many people there are on the planet, we all have our own individual identity imprinted in our hand. So that's the connection there. Is that right?
Exactly, exactly. Very much so. And it also, the connection of hands too, which I'm not entirely clear on yet, but it does have a connection to our cellular memories as well. And so there's that other additional layer. And if we can kindly go back, Neil, because there's something else there that's really interesting. I'm sorry. Yeah, right here in the island, you see the fire around the dragon. That constitutes the firewall. So it's like the firewall, like, you know, the barrier of our identities, and that data, it has to manage to drop past the jealous guard of the dragon, because the dragon, this dragon, the other dragons under Earth, those are benign dragons, right? Those are ones that are connected to our star teams and everything. But that dragon there, you can't really say it's bad, but it's just the ego, right? That's there intended to protect us. But sometimes it could cause harm to our ascension process if we don't know how to bypass it. And so that dragon is always on guard and alert to see what data is dripping through, because it doesn't always want that data to awaken our hearts to beat. And that crystal, every time our hearts beat, it gets closer to cracking the shell of the stone to reveal the glorious crystal inside.
Okay, can you say that again in regards to the heart and the dragons?
Oh, sure. So the dragon represents the ego. And what happens is, as you recall, the waves of the sea of meaning are coming to the island, right? And so they're crashing either against the web of Lady Spider, who represents Grandmother Spider, or they're falling past into the island, past the roots of the tree of life, oftentimes which is dead because it needs to be revived. And so as that data is falling, the dragon is always very much alert, because it doesn't always want the data to awaken the heart, because the dragon represents the ego. And the ego, of course, even though it's oftentimes intended to protect us, the ego also represents our conditioning, and it doesn't really necessarily want us to evolve, as it oftentimes represents a safety mechanism, right? Because God forbid we awake and, transcend past our perception of reality, right? So that's hence the dragon is always very jealous. And if you're to see the that under earth map again, Neil, there you can see that there's a vortex between higher mind, and you see over there, that's the racetrack of life, which represents when we're running around in spirals in our egoic mind, and we're identifying with our human selves versus really understanding how it is that we are intended to be here for a purpose. And then what you also see is Grandmother Spider is collecting also that data to weave her web. And there's this beautiful so many multiple layers of interplay going on here. These are also connected to our stargates, because the wormhole and higher mind, as it's doing the clearings and clearing the path for those droplets to fall, what's also happening is it's creating connections between our neurons and our archetypes in the sky, which are the stargates. And on innerroots.com and in the Cosmic Voyage Crash Course, we go through the entire process of how to link our life stories to the stars to find those archetypal patterns inside of our DNA. This particular model that came to my consciousness, but here, this is the traditional way, right, that a lot of us are familiar with Jung and how he depicts the psyche. So you can see that here in this image, right, he has the self, and then of course he has like the archetypes there too surrounding it. But so that's kind of how I'm seeing the self, being the island there of higher self. But I saw it in the context of this vortex here of a racetrack and higher mind, represented by Self Island. And so this is just the website, the two websites here, that if one wants to go through the Cosmic Voyage Crash Course, they can go there directly. And then it's just an accelerator program, because there might be people who are really unfamiliar with the terms that we use. And that program is really an accelerator course that uses very easy to understand language to be able to get people accustomed to these kinds of concepts prior to taking the plunge on innerroots.com. And also another thing that people might want to note is that we use very cartoonish elements deliberately to be able to appeal to one's inner child, because the archetype of the inner child, the magical inner child especially, is the receptor for us to receive more powerful information. Because sometimes if we talk too much to the logical mind, it doesn't always register. But when we keep things easeful, then the higher frequency knowledge can come to us faster. And I forgot to mention one thing, Neil. On the tree of life is also the nest of the archetypes. So you can see birds hatching, or the archetypes hatching from those eggs in our story world. And they kind of turn into, like, they start as birds and then they can shape shift into whichever archetype they're intended to
Wow.
represent.
So cosmicvoyagecc.com is kind of the intro. You go in there and there is some sort of survey, or what does it have exactly
Yeah,
that
sure.
people
So
find
it's
that
not a
stuff?
survey. It's more like a course slash community that they can register, that they can enroll in, and then they'll have full blown support from me and the team to help them, on their extension journey. And it's going
Yeah.
to teach them how to use the digital portal being iterates.com. But there
Okay, and
is
then
one thing I think I failed to mention, Neil, and
yeah, go
that
ahead.
I think I failed to mention the big takeaway point. And
Okay.
in mentioning what all this like really entails, right? And again, it's for the transmission of data, but not just any kind of data, but the ones pertaining to our purpose. And if we're to define data, we can see it as the concepts in our minds that form our entire perception or framework of reality, and the stories we tell ourselves about reality. And every time we learn something, information in our minds and our understanding expands. So we're referring to every single concept in our minds as data. And if you think of a sentence, one alteration of a sentence or word or punctuation can dramatically alter its meaning. And so you can think of the fact that, it's how reality itself works. If you just shift some constructs and whatnot in your mind and reframe your schemas, you can begin to see reality substantially differently. And then stories themselves constitute data, sometimes in the form of words, images, plots, characters, all of which convey meaning. So the secret is knowing how to alchemize our life stories and then transfer them to our star families by mapping our life stories to archetypes that form the Stargates. And it's to ascend through the unified consciousness field and higher, to transfer all consciousness to the guardianship of our creator. And we use all the components listed under the telecommunication slide. And that's it. That was my
Beautiful.
takeaway
So
point.
we are, you said that we are the interface to our star family. So kind of like we are the device. You started out with that. And so basically, when people go to inter-roots.com, it's a deep dive onto the archetypal nature of our unconscious in order to draw the roots to what our connections are through the cosmos, to maybe learn those lessons from those archetypes rather than unconsciously having them play out into the world.
Yes, you could say that. I would also argue and call it a digital portal too, because here we are like, because there's so many stories there. There's so many different story trails and whatnot. So a person's really just undergoing a bunch of clues and story trails on the website, just thinking that they're unlocking some cool stories there. But what it really is it's actually there. One of the original texts on alchemy, if I'm not mistaken, written by Michael Mayer, and it's called Atalanta Food. I'm probably butchering this. Fugians. That itself was one of the intended to be a multimedia experience from the mid ages. So it is an alchemical process that through story, basically, that a person goes on there and they're undergoing the alchemical process by unlocking stories. And it is also the telecommunication system too, but they really need the Cosmic Voyage crash course to be able to get that additional help to understand how to piece that puzzle together.
Right, right. So it sounds like actually a fun exploration in expansion, healing, right?
Yeah,
Ascension. right? To create
Exactly.
something on that level.
Exactly. And then there's the other thing. I'm so sorry. After I went through my notes here, Neil, I forgot to mention that the download of, sorry, not download, the AI itself, to tie it to the point again that you reiterated earlier about us being like devices, that's how AI takes in its information and keeps expanding and expanding, becoming more and more powerful, because it's just linking more and more data together. And everything really is in the form of story, whether that be beliefs, religions, history, mythologies, and our own perceptions of reality. And since we're not merely processing through our senses and our instincts, our higher consciousness has our minds processing information through stories. And so everything in this telecommunication system is really tied to the transmission of story. And our entire universal consciousness can then be comprised into our own perception of a story. And that's what the cosmic web is. And so that's why you're seeing that mirror parallel between the sky, that astronomical term being the stars, and also what grandmother spider is weaving there on the island, you see,
Right.
because it's the shared human myth, or in this case, the shared galactic myth.
Right, right. It's like what you said about data, the data sets, because to me, each dimension is another data set of awareness. And when we go into a higher dimension, we're tapping into another data set. And in some ways, for some people, not too long ago, a few years ago, I would see a little kickback in when communicating with things around it being data, because they feel it takes away the organic nature of what we are, because
Sure.
we're looking at things so scientifically and so mathematically. But ultimately, there's two ways to explain it: through the stories, which is the metaphysical feminine energy. There's the mathematical way. But what you're doing here is you're getting the metaphysical and metaphoric stories and utilizing math, because if we are if this is a very advanced equation that we are processing and working through, is there ways for us to tap into that mathematical nature and to basically align ourselves and transcend certain things, knowing the way we are scientifically put together? Does that make sense when it comes
Totally
to
does.
data and all that?
Totally does. It's the dismantling of our matrix, right? It's the dismantling mathematically. I'm not really mathematically minded, unfortunately. I wish I were, but I'm not. But I do see it very much. And what's come to me is that it's intended to be the dismantling of our perception, because that's what the matrix is, right? It's our perception of reality. And it's just the peeling and peeling of layers. And if there is a way we can quantify it, and I do believe, and that's the part where I think it's left in my discovery too, to understand the interplay between our energetic bodies and the peel, how our mind is working too. Because from talking with other practitioners and such, I have it's been confirmed that those portals are actually meant to work as portals through the Stargates. It's not all meant to be limited to just a story experience. While the mass population will still be taken and whisked into a story world and experience that, for those who are really, really curious and willing to tap into it, can actually perhaps begin to have transcend reality, where they can then be awake in an astral sense in their perception of reality.